How are you?
Very good. Very good.
All right,
I know
fantastic.
your name. I don't think we've met in person.
That was an amazing first panel. I'm super excited to do this second panel, and start with well, start with Matt Stoller on the end, Director of Research at the American Economic Liberties Project, and author of the book Goliath: The 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy. Also has a newsletter, also called Big. Probably the most underrated, influential like newsletter. If you don't subscribe to it and you're interested in antitrust, like you're doing yourself a disservice. I mean, lots and lots and lots of people in Washington read it. I'm actually amazed. People talk to me about it all the time. In Europe, I get people asking me, "Did you know about this monopoly?" I read it in Matt's newsletter. I'm like, no, I mean, I know about it because I read the newsletter, but otherwise would not have known about it. So thrilled to have Matt, Tim Cowan, chair of the antitrust practice at Preschool and Company. His practice covers a full range of competition law and regulatory matters arising across tech, media, and telecom. He is an incredible. He is incredibly knowledgeable about the ad tech market and the history of these laws. And I'm going to come back to him first to kind of frame this conversation. Next we have Dylan Carson, a partner at Manat, Phelps and Phillips, trial attorney with major experience in antitrust litigation, federal and state government, antitrust investigations, and competition law counseling. And you were at DOJ, right?
Correct.
Okay, sorry, I don't have that on here, but former DOJ official. Next, we have Stacy Mitchell, co-executive director of Institute for Local Self-Reliance. She's a writer, strategist, and policy advocate. Just been an incredibly influential advocate when it comes to anti-monopoly policy. We were just talking about how, again, that whole thing about 12 years ago, there were just not very many people paying attention to these issues. Stacy has just been an incredible advocate and just super knowledgeable about big tech and policy problems and societal problems. So super excited to have her here. And I thought a good way, because we are talking about history, Tim, and with an eye toward this ad tech market, I wanted to kind of turn it over to you and to help us frame this conversation from a historical standpoint. Tim also has a paper that he's written we have available at the front, so please get a copy of that as well. But Tim, I'd love to turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Teddy. So in preparation for this, I thought I'd tell you that I've been asked to write a book about competition law by the people at Oxford in England, which I thought was a tremendous honour. And I said, but why me? Why do you want me to write this? And they said, well, you've got a particular perspective. And you think, well, what's the perspective? Again, why me? Is it because, I was in a telecoms company and I litigated against AT&T and then became an advisor to Microsoft, or because I worked for Sidley Austin as a partner for 9 years? And they said, no. It's because you have a view from the car crash. So almost everything you've touched hasn't worked. Yeah. So with the car crash analogy as a thread through what I'm going to say, I think that my comments hopefully will be seen as a kind of crash investigator's report, if I can frame it that way for you. So first proposition is a real problem for a lot of people, so I'm going to repeat it a couple of times. Some markets always tend towards monopoly. We have known this for a very long time. Not all markets are free markets. Right? Some markets have economies of scale, economies of scope, to such an enormous extent that the more efficient the monopolist becomes, the more of monopoly will be generated. And that is true in most utilities, telecoms, technology sectors that benefit from those economies of scale, economies of scope, low variable costs, high returns, massive barriers to entry that are generated. So efficiency creates monopoly. This can cause economists to go mad because they're constantly looking for efficiency. If you look at merger control, let's look at how A plus B equals a more efficient outcome, but that could also be a monopoly. So we've got to remember that that's kind of a big starting point. Now, for a very long period of time in Europe, this was so well known and such a big problem, we nationalized those things. This is America. I know this is a strange concept. We had public ownership so that we had public interest outcomes. There was no mechanism through which the profit maximizer could maximize profit at the public's expense, because the idea was we owned it. Now that gave rise to a whole raft of other problems, but why in the US you have a rich regulatory and antitrust history, which frankly we don't have in the same depth for such an enormous period of time, is because we screwed things up through national ownership to a much greater extent. I joined British Telecom in 1992. I had to sign the Official Secrets Act because it was still partly owned by the government. Right? I know, there you go. You can see Silence in the room. Amazing. A telecoms company owned by the government, fully owned up to 1984. And that was the UK, right? So in lots of other countries, it was a lot more difficult. So I've made the first point, which is some businesses tend towards monopoly. You have this issue in the sort of businesses we're talking about where there's a public interest which is in conflict with the private interest, the profit maximization interest. So going back to my analogy with car crashes, the car will crash if the interests are not aligned. Now, what we've seen in most of the things that I've been involved in, whether they're structural or behavioral, is that the interest that the public authority, whether it's an antitrust authority or a regulator, is seeking to achieve is often imposed because they believe that the law will give them the outcome they want. So you're going to do this. And businesses giggle. They look at it and go, we're going to do that. Yeah, okay, we'll do exactly that. That means we're free to do everything else that wasn't specified. Right? So you have this massive problem that the people, actually I think there's lots of reasons for it, but the regulatory system is seeking a public interest outcome and a profit maximizing entity doesn't do it. So a good example of that would be the AT&T divestiture. You created a series of national long distance carriers that were coast-to-coast carriers. Growth of data networks was partly created as a consequence of that, but also the previous obligations that were imposed on IBM and the earlier AT&T 1956 consent decree, which Barry and others were talking about this morning. So you had a massive opening of markets, so they weren't being stifled and controlled by monopoly providers. The creation of the local access monopoly did create an incentive to maximize returns and degrade quality. So I was part of a business in the long distance part that suffered from that for quite a long time. And I think it's quite a useful example, because when we came in 1994 to acquire one of the long distance carriers, it was called MCI Communications, the Department of Justice said to us, look, we're in the business of making the world safe for American investment. They were quite open about that. And we came from a country which wasn't in the US, and we had a local loop monopoly, and they knew there was a problem with the local loop monopoly. So they said, look, you have the ability to control the monopoly for your own downstream benefit. So there's a vertical integration benefit. What are we going to do about that? And so we offered them a consent decree, the 1994 consent decree between BT MCI, a business called Concert, which is a US joint venture company, and the local access business. And I bring this up because I think it's one of the examples of something that has worked, which avoided a car crash and is actually continuing to work. And it works in a slightly different way. So when I tell you what to do and you giggle and you do other things, we recognize that was a bit of an issue. So we said, okay, that which we receive, we will give to others on non-discriminatory terms. Now that sets up a dynamic that you want as the downstream player to upgrade the upstream facility. It means the user of the monopoly facility wants to invest capital in making it better, rather than raising price, degrading quality, and increasing profit. What you do is reverse the incentive so that the user of the facility has an interest in it being better and more useful because you're going to use it. Now, that's worked pretty well. I wrote about that in an article recently. You can see that potentially working quite well in relation to a, whether you call it broken up or restructured Google system, the use of the index. This sounds awfully like telecoms, doesn't it? The use of the index, which is the thing that you have in an electronic database, which is identifying your name, address, telephone number, where you are. That's the white pages index. Every telecoms company has one. It's the basis on which you can make a phone call. It's the basis for yellow pages, which is then using the basic indexing system and providing advertising around it. Yes, there's an access of the underlying database. Google effectively has built its own index. But if its use of the index by the search, the relevance engine within Google search, if that were available on non-discriminatory terms on the same basis that Google has it, that would be a basis for a non-discriminatory access regulation where they would have an interest in making the index better because they use it. Now, I do understand the relevance engine is available, but currently only on terms where you have to use Google's advertising network as well, so you'd have to break that off. So, first point is collision arises from a collision of incentives. The second point is if you align incentives, which didn't happen in the AT&T breakup and did happen, what we did with the consent decree was when we had a new chief executive, and as those people who've worked in-house might know, you're sitting around wondering what you're going to say to your new chief executive to make yourself look good and make sure he doesn't just fire you on the spot. We had a chief executive who got a reputation for firing the first people he met. So one of my contributions to the debate early on was when he said, so what are we going to do about regulation? I said, I know. Focus on the monopoly. Now, believe me, that actually was said. And he went, that's great, because he's like most leaders. He works inside sound bats. So we focused on the monopoly, because what you probably don't know in this room, BT wasn't just regulated from a telecoms point of view, it was prevented from doing broadcasting. So rather like AT&T was allowed only to do telecoms, BT was only allowed to do telecoms. And this was true of most telecoms regulatory regimes around the world. So we said, look, can we get out of the box? Are we allowed to do broadcasting? So we've got this really great idea that you could do streaming over networks. We're going to build these fiber networks, and they're going to be fantastic. And we're going to build broadband capability, and it's going to be amazing. We don't really know what's going to happen. This was in the mid-90s. And the regulator said no. And eventually what we did was we proposed what you would think of as a consent decree. It was a competition remedy where we said, look, if we create this local access business and we make it available to everybody, and of course we'd already given AT&T access because the DOJ had required it, can we then, be allowed to do broadcasting? And after negotiating it for a while, they allowed that to happen. So we do have a thing in the UK called OpenReach, which is a type of alignment of incentives. It's not the only one. There is a report at the OECD about 100 functional separation remedies have been adopted, not in antitrust. They're typically used in utilities because the problem is one of high fixed costs. You've got this business that's going to continue to increase scale and efficiency, so you need to do something about vertical regulation, vertical integration. And so the regulatory systems focus on this disaggregation of the system, but there's plenty of precedent there. So if I can just sort of frame that as a starting point. So use of inputs. I keep banging away if I can about use of inputs. The previous debate raised this question, well, the inputs aren't just technology, it's actually data, and data is fundamental to, and I could go into a lot of detail about how what Google did when it acquired DoubleClick was to close down the DoubleClick ID. It then blocked the use of the JavaScript for header bidding. It's continually blocked the use of data by any third party that competes with it, that uses that data for generating advertising. A twist to this is the latest DOJ case against Google. I should have said Google and Apple, because Apple gets 36% of Google's ad revenues. Right, 36% of there's people in the crowd that don't know this. It's fantastic that Apple is actually living off advertising, whilst at the same time telling everybody advertising is bad and you should delete cookies and advertising is terrible and you should delete cookies. And they're living off the fact that they give Google unique access to all the data from anybody who has an iPhone anywhere in the planet. Right? That is a disaster for publishing, a disaster for third parties. Apple has every incentive. It's about 20 billion a year, so whatever that is in a month or an hour. I'll leave that to the people who can count to do. So their incentives are to block any data to anybody else that would compete with Google in advertising. Apple's in advertising. Apple is hugely incentivized. Apparently they make more profit out of the money that comes from Google, which of course it doesn't carry a lot of sales cost. They have a monthly meeting between chief executives. They have dinner. That must be a real chore. There's a big expense to that, I'm sure. But it's still not going to dent the income stream, which goes straight to the bottom line. I haven't done the maths recently, but at one point people said this was more money from Google than it makes from the sale of all of the Mac line of computers. Now, I'm expecting somebody to respond on that, but if we understand the issue, we can understand the impact on incentives actually derives from how much profit is made. So all of those players that are being given a share of Google search, the amount of money is important. It's not just the principle. It's got nothing to do with defaults. Defaults is a real side issue and a total mistake if we're going to focus on defaults. So inputs, data inputs. If you had a usage of data inputs obligation in the same way that Google uses it for third parties, that would be a big, big part of the solution. Now, there has to be non-discrimination obligations. There has to be transparency. One of the points that Barry made earlier is that you can end up with a regulatory superstructure which goes on forever, and everybody's getting involved in looking at every tiny little bit and bite and trying to understand how it all works together. What's absolutely critical for an effective remedy is not just that the person that it's imposed on has an aligned incentive, but that third parties get to see what's going on, and they're the ones that can say, hold on a minute, this doesn't work because of this, because there's no way even in the highly educated American regulatory environment where everybody's a genius, they just don't know enough. Nobody ever knows enough. No individual ever knows enough. So you've got to have a huge marketplace of people looking over the shoulder of the person who's subject to the obligation, and then an arbitration mechanism or a adjudication mechanism that isn't going to take forever, right? And again, that's a big problem because there's a huge incentive to walk slowly backwards. When I took over as general counsel, BT's strategy towards regulation was known as walking slowly backwards. So for my sins, I changed it, but I think that changes with the incentives. So to go back and say, I agree with Christina, much of what she was saying I completely support, but I think this core point about aligning incentives is fundamental. So I said I'd give you a view from the car crash. I've given you some points along the way that didn't work, and hopefully that's a way of aligning things for the future. One of the things that, from a car mechanics point of view, happens if you don't align the wheels is that gradually, you don't just immediately have a crash. What actually happens is that wheel alignment means that your tires wear in a slightly different way, and eventually you have a puncture. Now, clearly, if you're going along at some speed, that can cause quite a lot of problems. So I do think that this point of alignment needs to be central. Teddy, I haven't covered in detail what's happening in ad tech, but I can do. I have dealt with that in an article, but we can come back to that.
Let's come back to that. We've got you've set the table with a lot of ideas. You've talked about some utility type rules, conflicts of interest. I just want to kind of open it up to the other panelists to, get a reaction to what Tim said. And then, I've got a bunch of questions after that. But any thoughts, Matt?
I mean, I could just listen to you all for the whole panel. Do I have any thoughts?
Or yeah, go ahead, Dylan.
I can jump in. First, quick disclosure, I worked at the Antitrust Division on the Google investigation, but not the litigation, and so I'm not going to discuss any confidential information, even if I could remember it. Because although John said it wasn't that long ago, some antitrust cases do take a long time. I think AT&T started in 1974 and finally went to trial in like 1982. So we are moving relatively fast today. I did want to respond to one point on the index and the kind of the cost of an index. Fiona Scott Morton put out a paper yesterday, I think, probably in anticipation of the hearing in front of Judge Mehta tomorrow, about potential remedies in the Google search case. And one of the ones that she discussed I thought was pretty good. The social value of trying to lower barriers to entry and encourage other entrants into search is going to be really expensive. It costs a whole lot to crawl the web every day and create an index. So she posits that one of the potential remedies, and I thought it was sound, was some kind of FRAND, fair, reasonable licensing for other competitors to use the Google index and make it available. That could lower barriers to entry. I could start tomorrow. Teddy could start tomorrow. Ask Teddy instead of ask Jeeves. Start your business and try to get into it. I think that licensing could be a potential conduct remedy, which could have some legs. And then the only thing I wanted to follow up, if you viewed car crashes, does that make us all crash test dummies? We're just along for the ride.
Very good. Just on the point about what is essentially a reseller remedy. If you've got an index, then I use the analogy with Yellow Pages. So Yellow Pages uses the White Pages index. What Google does is it copies the web because there are different addresses and there's different things that you're looking for. So the search isn't just against the URL or IP address or anything of that type. It's actually against the page. So it is a bit different. It's hugely expensive. The brand that Google has got, which if you look at Judge Mehta's opinion, he takes the point that the search engine, by all the metrics, the internal and external metrics, is producing more relevant results from a broader category of inputs than others. So Google's doing something that's actually pretty world-beating and very clever. So you'd say, well, okay, that's fine. That's a massive barrier to entry. If you were to abolish the payments to Apple or the payments to, the distributors of Android phones, the problem is a twofold problem. If you're Verizon, it's a pity Bill Barr isn't here at the moment. If you're Verizon, and let's say you're getting 1.4 billion a year, which is in the judgment, from Google as a payment for distributing phones that have Google search on them, that's a big chunk of change. That's a lot of money. You don't want that to go away. So if you abolish the default and you say, okay, it's an Android phone, Google's still going to get paid. You can't get rid of that incentive. That incentive is a disincentive on Verizon from going into search or from promoting anybody else that's in search, because that might upset the person who's supplying you with all of those nice phones that's giving away Android for free. So it's not about the contractual provisions at all. It's about the incentives for innovation. So I think the Teddy search, if we call it that, is fundamental, because unless you've got something which is a low-cost entry opportunity, you won't get over the other barriers that you can't really get rid of. And one of the barriers that is very difficult to get rid of is Google's brand. I mean, you could say, look, they should be stripped of their brand. because they've made billions and billions and billions out of illegal activity. This should, fire the chief executive, go to jail, all the rest of it that you can do. It's not going to do any good because from a consumer benefit point of view, the consumers have benefited from a very, very good search engine. So licensing the product, Teddy Search would benefit from everybody knowing that Teddy Search has Google inside, right? That would be a very useful way of using the brand that's been generated, but for public interest outcomes. And they would also have an incentive to upgrade Google Search because they'd be using the same stuff. You could also see what would happen. At the moment, about 80% of the search results page is ads, text ads, or various different things. If you license the underlying inputs, then you could have lots of different companies. Apple might, for example, actually resell the use of that or present that with relevant search results. And there's a novel idea that you'd actually have really relevant results in a much greater proportion of the page. You'd have fewer ads, and the consequence of that would then potentially help the other side of the market. So the big problem that you've got from the consumer point of view, which is clutter and this morass that you have, actually translates into an advertising problem. Because Google gets really, really good returns on its advertising. If you license Google Search, then you could get third parties to come in to advertise, and you might have fewer ads that were higher value. So Teddy would make a fortune with Teddy Search because you'd attract all of these advertisers that are advertising beside relevant results. And of course, that gets over the other problem, which was in our European case, which is Google promoting its own products into the search results pages over rivals, which has happened for news, comparison shopping, maps, etc. I mean, you go to Teddy Search, they might have a really useful map.
I mean, I love this idea of Teddy Search, by the way. But
I
go ahead, Matt.
So I kind of want to take issue with a couple of basic points. First of all, I still could listen to you for the rest of the panel. I just want to make that clear. So there's sort of this view, this has come up on the last panel and this panel, that these corporations are just profit maximizing. We have to just accept that that's what they do and that's what they'll always do. And I just don't think that that's accurate. I think that we've seen corporations act in very different ways over the last 200 plus years that corporations have been chartered. We can, Richard Hofstadter talked about how all corporations in the 60s, they were acting with I think it was like looking at over their shoulder at the antitrust division. So there was just a different framework. The idea of just sort of shareholder maximizing corporations is a relatively new phenomenon. So I don't think that we should accept that, oh, well, they're just going to act in bad faith if you're not very explicit. Like, no, that's just a moment where we've allowed essentially criminal activity at a high level for 40 years, such that now that's just kind of what organizational, institutional leaders think is how business is done. And I don't think that that's something we should be surprised at, but it is something that you have to grapple with, right? In order to do any of the lovely things that you're talking about, and I mean, I think a lot of them sound compelling, we could quibble on some of the details, but you have to have a basic rule of law. And I don't think that we have a strong rule of law right now. And one of the things that we're seeing in these cases is a recapturing of what the rule of law means. Things like you can't destroy documents, right? Things, I mean, I like that people chuckle, but it's like, and we essentially are, this is one of the things I want to say is we're essentially like, the big difference, I think, between the AT&T case and the Microsoft cases, actually we've broken up AT&T 3 times in the 20th century. So I should say the 1982 case and the Microsoft case and today is that AT&T and Microsoft were anomalies. And today Google is part of a broad political push. Like nobody ran in 1996 or 2000 on an anti-monopoly platform talking about Microsoft. George Bush ran and saying, I'm going to settle it. But today, you see a lot of questions about big business in general. So you have a different framework. There's a broad dissatisfaction and anger about how we have structured big business. And that's more similar to the 1950s. It's more similar to the 19-teens than it is the 1980s and 1990s. So we can look at the specific details of how these corporations acted and lessons from it, but it's a very different moment. I mean, if I would say one thing that Microsoft learned in the late 1990s is that they should just have a better lobbying operation, right? And they also, were afraid of the DOJ. There was a deterrence effect, which is one of the reasons you see Google and Facebook and a bunch of the other companies emerged, but they ultimately learned the wrong lesson. And so I think we have to consider that political, I don't want to say political corruption because that's not, yeah, I think that we have to consider sort of the rule of law as a foundational element. And we also have to assume, so that the rule of law has to be foundational here. And the other part is that we have to move away from the idea that corporations are just profit maximizing entities. Corporations are chartered by the state. They can be chartered in lots of different ways. So when, Tim, when you talked about, you could throw CEOs in jail, you can tell them not to, and that won't make any difference. I think it will make a difference. I think if a CEO goes to jail, I'm not saying a CEO is going to go to jail because there's a civil case and whatnot, but, these guys know that the worst that could happen is that they have to do a few more meetings, right? And that's, I don't love meetings, right? But that's not a huge penalty, right? So Kent Walker, what he did in terms of telling Google employees to shred documents, that's a pervasive pattern right now across. I'd be very surprised if Apple's not doing the same thing. And I agree with you that Apple and Google are a cartel. But we have to start looking at these corporations differently, and I think that's what we are relearning how to do. And so in other words, in order to solve for any of the problems you're talking about, in order to align incentives, in order to allow Teddy Search to have Google inside and not have Google sabotage it, you need to have someone at Google who is afraid that if they subvert the rule of law, that there will be penalties. So that's kind of my one quick quibble.
I want to. We dive right into utility style rules, and I want to take a step back. And Stacy, maybe you can help me with this and think about what is, part of the U.S. anti-monopoly history and tradition that is, and we talked about this on the last panel a little bit, that is so focused on preventing conflicts of interest and and making sure that markets are fair, and then subsequently contrasting that with what we have now. I could spend all day, every day, just having my journalists look into conflicts of interest in big tech, and they would have absolutely no time to do anything else. And so I would love to get your perspective on. I know you think a lot about utility regulation as well, but anything you can talk about, in terms of utility style rules, anti-monopoly tradition, and just the level of conflicts of interest that we have right now.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for hosting this, and it's great to be here, and I'm such a fan of the Capital Forum. I think ultimately, we have to save these companies from themselves. It's just shopping on Amazon is a shitty experience. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary that 30 years on from Amazon's founding, we have no actual competition in an industry that we should. There are no other platforms. There are no general purpose platforms for shopping. There are, nothing in the way of what we should see in terms of specialty platforms for shopping. Why is there not a place what's dedicated to toys, for example? It's an interesting industry. It's innovative. There are lots of small companies. It's a different kind of shopping experience, apparel. But there are no shopping platforms really that are actually competing with Amazon in these different ways, and the experience is increasingly degraded. This is true of Google. We heard from the earlier panel, just the experience of search and also the results that you get, the ways in which the dominance of these platforms is, altering the way that people set up websites in ways that make it pretty miserable out there to look things up. And also, you look at, we have a whole generation of businesses, retailers, consumer product makers who are orienting their entire business to how can I come up with the one thing that I can get on Amazon and make a little bit of money right now. It's not about what do customers need or what would be a cool product or any other actual consideration that should go into founding a business. And so things are so incredibly warped right now, and by really addressing fundamentally the power of these companies, we can start to get them. I mean, the good people at Google, if we break up Google and do a number of other things, can go back to actually designing products that are good and work, as opposed to spending all of their time entrenching themselves. I think, to get to your question, I think what's really interesting to look back, in terms of the American tradition, we, in a monopolization case, you focused on these particular strategies or behaviors or integrations that allowed a company to create a monopoly and maintain a monopoly. But then when you get to the remedy phase, the aperture opens wide up. Now you're talking about, well, what is it that there's a lot of room there in terms of what can be ordered. Like, what is it that we need to make these markets competitive and fair? And a lot of stuff can come into that category. And so you're not narrowly limited to sort of addressing the particular things that were part of the findings in the case. You're now looking not backwards at what's been done, but ahead to what it is that we need to do to actually create innovation and growth. And I think that leads you in a number of directions. I mean, we've heard a lot and talked a lot already about data, like how do we divest Google effectively from the data that really is our collective data? How do we make it available properly to create competition? I think the idea of the indexing being a sort of utility, a public utility that's available on those kinds of terms is really interesting. And then the other two things that I think come to mind as key questions, like, as we think about like how do you create competitive markets, what is it that potential entrants need to actually succeed in this space? And so, the data piece is one. Another is the integrations that give rise to the incredible conflicts of interest. I think what's striking about the big tech companies is they monopolize markets not particularly through behaviors, although there are behaviors and there are tactics that are anti-competitive, but their monopolization strategies are really about integrating different business lines and using the interplay between those integrations to dominate and to control and to exclude. And so figuring out where you draw those lines and where you spin off different pieces of a business in order to remove those incentives entirely, as well as just the opportunities to do those things. Because the behaviors is whack-a-mole if you don't actually deal with the underlying integration. So, in the case of Amazon, it's the integration of the first-party retail, Amazon's own retail sales, and third-party retail, the marketplace, combined with logistics. Those three pieces need to be separate. It's interesting to look at like Shopify as a potential competitor in e-commerce, and they've really struggled because they've needed to try to build a logistics system, which they haven't been able to do because it's so capital intensive. And they don't need to do that in a competitive market. They only need to do that because Amazon has one, and Amazon uses its logistics, its shipping and warehousing to reinforce its e-commerce monopoly, and now has inserted itself in the payment process on Shopify sites in such a way that it's making it easier for Amazon to begin to pull business away from Shopify. You spin off Amazon's logistics, you remove that, and you also open up opportunity for other e-commerce players. And then the last thing I think is which we've already talked about some, is the patent licensing. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to take Amazon again. They have a lot of patents around, figuring out the gobbly stuff, whatever, the muddled stuff that you put into the search bar, figuring out what you actually mean. So there's a set of tools around that. Should there be compulsory licensing? They have a lot of warehousing technologies that, again, sort of invite the idea if we want to have competition in e-commerce delivery, maybe we should think about those licenses.
And one thing I want to keep harping on is, this gets to Matt's point a little bit, which is like there has to be some rule of law, like to make sure that the people at Google are complying with any kind of like a remedy or anything like around indexing or things like that. But part of it is you also mentioned, Tim, specifically getting the incentives aligned. And getting incentives aligned also means removing conflicts of interest. And so I want to stay on the conflicts of interest a little bit longer, either specific to Google or specific to U.S. history or any kind of breakup or rule to prohibit conflicts of interest, what is that? How do you see that being applied, as a principle? Hey, this has been done before. We didn't like this conflict of interest. We got rid of it historically, or specifically to Google. Hey, here are all the conflicts of interest. I mean, we could spend all day talking about that, but maybe if we could kind of touch on this seems like something I don't want to, take for granted. That hey, we're going to align the incentives like that. That actually is like a meaty challenge for the judge, potentially.
Yeah, so the way it works under our law is that we, in Europe at least, and under UK law is a little bit different, but it's not a lot different, is that if you've got someone who's a recidivist, a reoffender, then you, under Regulation 1 in Europe, you can then adopt a structural remedy as your first remedy. It means there has to be a history, right? So if I give you some detail, Google bought DoubleClick in 2008. It then disrupted rivals' ability to compete. It provided its ad exchange a right of first refusal, otherwise known as a first look. So Google gets a first look on all matching ads. A bit later on, it then did a last look as well. So that's like in the stock exchange, you're bidding on something, everybody else gets to bid, and you get a first look, and then when they've all bid, you get a last look. I mean, this is just cheating on the ad exchange. It's a conflict of interest because you're both the stockbroker, the ad supplier, and you own the exchange. So there's clearly a fundamental problem there. Has that taken place over a long period of time? Yes, because 2008 is quite a long time ago, and it's continuing today. So that trial starts beginning of next week. I've just touched on the list. I mean, we call it the 19 crimes case because a friend of mine likes a bottle of wine which is called 19 Crimes, and it's a good way of remembering it. But actually, there are a list of 19 different things that they did over that period of time from 2008, and they're still going on. And the latest of which is blocking third-party cookies, because that blocks third parties' ability to use data in competition. So you can also probably make it 20 because of the Apple arrangement. So this isn't just one conflict of interest. This is a litany of examples. It goes on a very long list. I want to pick up Matt's point because I think you're right. I mean, I think that not every company behaves really badly, but this one does. Right. And it might be, I don't want to be, I know this is a video thing, but the whole Vegas thing where the general counsel says what goes on in Vegas, it's called apparently inside Google, it's called Vegas. So they have a chat facility which is normally switched off. So what goes on in Vegas stays in Vegas. So nobody knows what happened. But the internal emails and that sort of thing, most companies, Google no exception, thinks on email. So, you can see how the organization functions through the email and disclosure and all of that which goes on. So, I guess they've been assuming that nobody was going to look very closely. But this thing that came out last week about...
No, precisely the opposite. That's why they've been deleting documents.
Because
They
they
literally had a
thought-
policy that said, delete documents because we're under scrutiny.
And that's because they're a good organization that's altruistic. No, I mean, the problem is it kind of does tend to fit the narrative that this is a profit-maximizing organization that will do everything and anything to suit itself by comparison to others. But I completely agree that other organizations don't necessarily behave that way. It's not an inevitability, but it does tend to be. The problem is that if you incentivize businesses and CEOs and with return on capital or return on share price improvements, that tends to feed its way through the entire incentive schemes within the organization. There is a big issue which we're tackling in a completely different way from a European point of view, which is called the CSDDD directive, where what happens there is if you say you're going to do something which is about environmental and corporate social responsibility from July, you can now get sued for it. And that's going to make a massive difference to international supply chains, because it has been the case for many, many years that big corporations in the West have been transacting through entire supply chains through, whether it's with Taiwan or fast fashion into Southeast Asia. So you're offshoring the cost into jurisdictions that are employing children to make your clothes. Now, that's a matter of shame. That's a matter of something that nobody was doing. They thought they were okay because what they were saying, it wasn't us. But actually, if you're now responsible for what's going on, you then do start to incentivize good behavior. And I think that's been missing. So, I mean, CSDDD we do not have in the UK, but it's a very interesting move it was really the European Parliament that pushed it. A lot of European companies find it really quite shocking and difficult to live with, but it is changing the way that supply chains are now being addressed. So, hopefully that is a kind of pointer towards how you generate and focus good behavior for companies.
Can I let Dylan, or go ahead, Matt?
No, please.
Dylan, do you think the DOJ is ready to ask for these types of bold and laid the groundwork to basically say, hey, the only type of remedy that will really work here are fundamentally structural remedies to successfully, eliminate these conflicts of interest? And just would love to get your take on how you think things are set up for DOJ to make a big ask, or are they, what your thoughts are there?
Sure. Yeah. So I think DOJ is well positioned to ask for both structural relief and some conduct relief, and we know that because they asked for it in the past. So in AT&T, there was both structural and conduct remedies. In Microsoft, they asked for structural remedies, but neglected to stop Judge Jackson from dispensing with a hearing where the broken up party might have had a chance to dispute what the DOJ was asking for, and the DC Circuit thought that that was a bad idea, and in overturning the decision, found that a structural remedy wasn't appropriate. So we've got good precedent on DOJ being aggressive. And I think one of the kind of overlooked cases in software structural remedies is the Bazaar Voice case, when Bazaar Voice bought power reviews without review under the HSR Act, and Bill Baer and friends went in and got the court to unscramble the eggs, asked for structural relief to return the power reviews to its prior self as best it could. And I think both DOJ and the court acknowledged in that process that behavioral remedies and getting a compulsory licensing system in place so that the acquirer of the divested assets would have access to the syndicated services that were all housed in one entity at the time was an essential part of the remedy. And what the DOJ learned, I think, from Microsoft was you needed a good monitor to enforce that remedy. And the monitor they chose was one of the state AG lawyers from New York who worked on enforcing the Microsoft decree. So took advantage of that prior learning in I think bringing that remedy to a successful conclusion and unwinding or unscrambling the eggs in the software business, which is incredibly complicated and very hard.
Okay, great. And we've got a few minutes left before we are going to hear from the esteemed Bill Baer. And so I wanted to open things up to the audience for questions. I mean, I have a bunch more, but want to let people have the opportunity to ask their own questions. Jake, we got one here in the front. Or do we have does anyone have the mic? Yeah. notice? Right here.
Hello. In this era of post-Citizens United, how does that impact the monopolies that you see in that originally corporations had some interest in the public good, and now they seem to not even be accountable or transparent even to persons who own stock in them, and CEOs seem to have unlimited power and authority without accountability, even to stockholders. How does that affect the acts of having monopolies?
Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
So it's a really good question, and I think there are 3 cases against Google, and there's the Epic case, there's the search case, and then there's the ad tech case. I don't know, and so that's 3 different judges with 3 different potential remedies, and I don't know if they're talking, or I don't know of any situation like that historically. But a big overhang here is the politics, right? So this is a different moment than 1996 or 1984, whatever it is. The first of all, corporations are much more powerful, but their legitimacy is much weaker. So there's a broad dissatisfaction and anger about what big business has been doing, which wasn't the case in the 80s and 90s. So those 2 things are in tension with one another. And I don't know how the Tunney Act would play into this, but depending on who wins the election and what their choices are, and I don't think anybody knows what either one will do, that could have a big impact on how these cases go, whether they're settled on the cheap, whether there's much more aggressive action. But part of what's happening more broadly is that, if you look at Citizens United as part of a whole series of kind of quasi-libertarian thinking stretching back to the 70s, that era is kind of being rolled back in the courts in certain ways, and then just saw a big decision on Section 230, and then with a lot of these cases. So it is, things look really bad in terms of concentration, profit margins, things like that, but the loss of legitimacy is really, you can't get that back. So I think we're kind of not heading back to that era of the 2000s, 2010s. I don't know where we're heading, but it's not. This is a surly public in the U.S. and actually all over the world.
Stacy?
I think, there's a recognition that in the last few years, Americans have become much more comfortable with the exercise of government authority with regard to structuring the economy, and that the reason for that shift is often traced to the pandemic, and government did all this spending and did all this sort of stuff, and so that's sort of what's acclimated people more to that idea. And there's probably some truth to that, but I actually think that the origins of it are a bit earlier and really have to do with the recognition of monopolies as a kind of governing force in our lives, and especially true with the tech companies. Their ability to effectively regulate what it is that we see, what we have access to control how markets operate, to set the rules, and all of those sorts of things. There was a kind of light bulb moment, I think, in our politics where sort of fears about that had always been couched in terms of big government controlling us went, oh, well, wait a second, there's a whole set of companies that control us. And that, I think, has been just a really powerful realization that has driven a lot of the new sort of thinking and energy around if we need to be making decisions about how our markets operate. And that means not only aggressive antitrust, but what is industrial policy? What should we be doing in terms of investment? What are the things that should actually be publicly controlled? And so in a lot of ways, I think the realization about monopolies has actually driven a pretty fundamental shift in how Americans understand public power and private power that hopefully is going to bring us in a direction of dealing with the deep corruption and all the things that you alluded to.
I thought the last panel had a really good way of wrapping up, which was what are the stakes here? What is the cost to societally to innovation. One thing that you said, Stacey, triggered my memory is that unions are very popular now, and so there's this public awareness of this manipulation of the worker and the oppression of the worker as well that you see in a lot of these big tech companies as well. What are the stakes to all your minds of getting a remedy in Google right? Not just for Google, but also we talked about Amazon setting a precedent for successfully addressing conflicts of interest in big tech. I'd love to get everyone's thoughts on that, and I think we can wrap up for lunch.
I can start. The stakes are whether the next Google, the next innovative company that wants to take advantage of the market dynamic change that is wrought by whether it's a consent decree or just a final judgment from one of the judges, that the things that allowed Apple and Google to take off after the Microsoft consent decree, that the interconnection where iTunes for Windows was allowed to flourish and the iPod could be created, giving Apple the funds to grow a business that led to the iPhone. So if the remedy doesn't allow for future innovation, then we're all going to be lesser for it.
Matt?
Yes, there's a great paper that just came out by a historian named Noam Magor. I think that's how you pronounce it. But anyway, he looked at the political economy of 19th century America. I think the stakes are much bigger. And what he found is that the network system of the railroads was treated differently all over the world. Railroads were a worldwide phenomenon. And in a lot of places where you had that were colonial, like India and Mexico and different countries today that are poor or middle income, they essentially didn't deal with the short haul, long haul rate differential problem. They deregulated the railroads and allowed railroads to focus on efficiency. And in the US, we didn't do that. We imposed price controls, rate regulation, an aggressive series of state and then federal regulatory policies to neutralize the power of the railroads, knowing that it would be less efficient. And in doing so, created home markets in lots of different states and a diversified manufacturing agricultural economy and a middle class. So in many ways, if we don't get Google right, if we can't get Google right, we won't get anything else right. If we don't get Google right, and it's not that one case particularly matters, there's a whole bunch of stuff we're throwing at the wall. But broadly speaking, if all that stuff doesn't amount to addressing their role as a coercive middleman, then I think we are looking at a situation where the U.S. kind of loses its vitality and we become kind of a set of just a not free people that are producers of kind of raw material, like just simple raw materials at the behest of these network systems that get to control who we are.
Tim?
Yeah, I was very taken. I'm always very impressed with Barry Lynn's advocacy and his comment in a way that which I'm not going to try and do it. But the tyranny point, I think is it says, well, is that really the case? Well, let me give you a story to end with. James Rosewell and I set up a thing called Movement for an Open Web, and that's a group of businesses, technology companies, ad tech companies, publishers, people involved in publishing newspapers and making sure that they're available. So our membership is actually in the publishing business. And we employed the former editor of The Independent in the UK, Chris Blackhurst, for a year. And we wrote story after story after story about what Google and Apple and how this system works. And we would, Chris would know the person who was the correspondent that was a friend that used to work for him on The Guardian or The Telegraph or whichever newspaper it was. It's a relatively small pool in the UK. And they'd say, look, it's great. And you know, the story was fantastic. And then it would go up to management, and management would go, oh, no. This is a story about Google. If we publish that, we might not be found in search results. If we're not found in search results, we don't have any income. So I just leave you that as an issue of tyranny, because that's happening today, and there's fewer and fewer news publishers. So you don't have a diversity of the media, you don't have a diversity of voices if you don't have a diversity of news publishers.
All right, well, thank you. I want to give, please give our panelists a round of applause.